one of the best evidences for Jesus' resurrection is that we're still talking about it.
Absolutely. It's a good point about, when you look to the early church and you look at what some of those writers were saying, what were the apologists of the early church saying about, why this is true? A lot of them were pointing to the fact that the church exists, right? That was the language they were using. They were pointing directly at the community of believers and saying, that's all the proof we need.
Love God, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Welcome to the AC Podcast. This is Andy Steiger, and I am here today with Wesley Huff.
Howdy.
And special guest, Ben Mcdonald.
How's it going?
Going really good.
Good.
How you guys doing?
Yeah, doing well. Glad to have Ben here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I just came to get workout tips from Wes, and all of a sudden you guys roped me into this podcast.
I don't work out. I look like this.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
So
workout tips is just flex wherever you
Yeah.
go.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
wow.
That's how that works.
You got to figure that one out.
Yeah, so Andy, where are we?
Yeah, we got to talk about where we are. We are currently in Washington, D.C. We're at the Museum of the Bible, and this is actually really special. We are in the Meggido Mosaic exhibit. We have been given special permission to film here. We've been filming we've filmed for 2 days, and we're currently right here with the mosaic, which is beautiful, amazing. Honestly, guys, I feel privileged. We get a podcast in here. It's pretty cool.
So we want to say a big thank you to the Museum of the Bible for letting us be here, letting us do something like this, and letting us showcase our newest employee, Ben, in this location. Because, Andy, we were prepping some stuff for the new Can I Trust the Bible series, and it's been really crazy since everything that's taken place with the Joe Rogan stuff and kind of the ripple effect of that, where the Museum of the Bible reached out and they said, we have some of this stuff, and it kind of coincided with some of our plans in a way that, arguably was divinely appointed. And so we're going to rope some of the content in, tell you a little bit about this in just a minute. But it worked out really well, and then we invited Ben over to meet us down here in D.C.
Yeah, absolute privilege to be here doing this for my first podcast ever with you guys. I think this is an incredible discovery behind this, and I'm
It's a high bar. You're like, where do we go from here?
It's only down.
It's only
It's
down.
not getting better.
No, but this has been excellent. It's been nice to be in Washington with you guys and to be joining you on such a momentous thing here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. And like we said, we're going to talk about this mosaic. Before we jump into things, let's just first hear a little bit about yourself, Ben. Where do you live? Feel free to flex a little.
Yeah, absolutely. Not actually around West Buff over here. But actually, so Wes and I actually know each other. Wes and I went to school together at Wycliffe College, where we were both doing our doctoral work. And after Toronto, I went back to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is where I live now with my wife and my daughter, Josephine. And I work at Acadia University. I do some adjunct lecturing there. I also recruit for the college. And then with everything that was happening with you, I ran into Andy and things came together and suddenly I got thrown into the mix. So
So officially you are our director of the Maritimes.
That's right.
Out there in Halifax, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, so Wes and I were like, man, we are legitimately Apologetics Canada now from coast to coast.
Yeah, we're a coast-to-coast organization.
Yeah.
We went from Apologetics Canada only being in British Columbia to Apologetics Canada creeping out across the country. So now we are officially coast-to-coast Apologetics Canada.
And I just want to give a shout out to all of you that have been supporting us, following the work that we're doing, and getting involved. We're so incredibly thankful and really honored. I think you'd agree, Wes. It's been kind of overwhelming, the support that we've received, and we just really want to say thank you.
Yeah, we're truly able to do what we do through the financial and prayer partnership of those who support the ministry. So we're able to do things like make this possible, make the Can I Trust the Bible series possible, make the branded series, make the video projects, but also have people like Ben come alongside and increase our reach. We've been asked to do events out on the East Coast for a while, and it's just been something that we would have loved to do, but because we're doing so much else, so many other places, so it's really it's an exciting privilege to see the way that we've grown. But you're out on the East Coast.
Yeah. That's right.
And tell us a little bit about your doctoral work and sort of the areas of interest that make you tick.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did my doctoral work looking at a little bit of Christology, actually, which is one of the things makes this very exciting for me. I did my doctoral work on the concept, the idea of kenosis, which you find in Philippians 2, right? This is the kenotic hymn, the self-emptying of Christ, and kind of looking at different Christological models of that and how it's played itself out. I'd say one of my major interests as well is just secular modernity and how Christianity fits into the cultural context that we're in today.
For those who maybe aren't familiar with kenosis, why don't you just unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the kenotic hymn that Paul has in Philippians 2, basically verses 5 to 11, okay, where it says that Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. That word kenosis has been debated throughout the ages in terms of what does it actually mean? What is it referring to? What is being emptied and who is doing the emptying? And when you take a look at that across a sort of spectrum, you get some radically different answers.
Now, specifically, we're talking about Jesus' divinity
That's right.
and humanity. Like we're talking about, what does that look like?
Yeah, precisely. Well, this is something you might hear from time to time, and you'll hear it in churches, sadly, is that people tend to think, when they're thinking of the incarnation, they might say something like, well, Jesus put his divinity aside, right? And they might get that idea from something like the kenotic hymn, this idea, well, he emptied himself, so he put aside his divinity. But of course, that's not what Paul is talking about, right? Christ's divinity is actually revealed in his weakness in the form of a slave, right? And part of that verse is the morphe totheo, the idea of though he was in the form of God, he took the form of a slave, right? And so Jesus isn't emptying himself of divinity. If anything, he is showing that his actual divinity is revealed, that glory is revealed by taking the form of a slave, revealed in his weakness. So,
I love that. I love that because really, one of the things we'll often say is if you want to know what God looks like, look at Jesus.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? And when that's the beauty of, well, what does God look like in the person of Jesus? Well, it looks like humility, as we see in Philippians chapter 2, willing to take the form of a servant.
Precisely.
And came to serve and to not be served.
Mm.
I don't know about you guys, but man, that I find that very encouraging.
Yes, absolutely. What I would say is that some people have obviously taken that terminology, they've used kenosis, and they've used it to say radically different things. For instance, in the 1960s, there was a movement called the Death of God movement. This was J.J. Altizer and a guy named William Hamilton. It made the cover of Time magazine, Is God Dead, right? They were using a sort of kenotic notion. It was more of a Hegelian philosophical sense of kenosis, but that was the language they were using to talk about Christ's self-emptying. And what they meant by that is God has emptied himself without remainder, and therefore atheism turns out to be the right answer. Well, that's obviously a radically different translation of that text, but also just the Christian narrative in general than I think we're used to. And so I was interested in exploring things like that. And
so that would have been playing off of Nietzsche's.
Absolutely, yeah. They were
and-
very much influenced by Nietzsche. But it just goes to show the ways in which this is sort of a question of hermeneutics, right? How people read Scripture and the ways they translate it, and getting down to what does it actually mean? What is it actually saying, and what is it revealing? And just relating it to this, to the Meggido Mosaic, it's interesting because here's where we have something that shows us how early on, how Jesus was viewed Christologically, where a developed Christology actually existed at such an early time.
Well, and let's talk about that because this Meggido Mosaic is said to be, outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest archaeological discovery that we currently have. Which, I mean, that is a bold statement.
That's a very big statement.
And the reason that they're saying this is because this mosaic dates to around the year 230, and it has this high Christological statement on it. So, Wes, why don't you unpack that for us a bit? Like what is being said here that's so significant?
Yeah, so it has the earliest inscription of Jesus being called God outside of the New Testament. So obviously within the New Testament, we have multiple statements like that in Philippians, all throughout the Gospels of Jesus being described with either the honors, the attributes, the names, or the deeds of being Yahweh God. But in terms of some sort of like overt archaeological inscription or something, and in one way we shouldn't expect to see that. The Christians were this group. They weren't the ones necessarily building the palaces and inscribing things on walls. And so one of the, I think, shocking factors of something like this is that you do find an inscriptional archaeological writing on the floor, which is what this is, of a building, which is arguably, I mean, I think this is being described as the earliest church coming from the 3rd century. Because if we think of a church,
Would have been a place of worship.
a place of worship where this community would have come together and they would have celebrated. I mean, what's in the middle is a table. And Andy, you and I were talking about earlier. Why is there a table in the middle? Well, I don't think it's a bold claim to say, well, hey, what do Christians do at a table? Well, they do something like, well, what do we call the sacrament? The Lord's table, right? So I think we can reasonably assume what would have been going on here in terms of the worship life of the community. And on the floor, it has this inscription given to this individual, a keptos, and it says, in honor of God, Jesus Christ. And so this is not just, a passing statement, especially in the society that would have seen and understood who the God and gods were. It's not a small statement to associate Jesus with something like that titled.
Yeah, and I want to unpack this a bit because it is so significant. First, this akeptos, it says, is a lover of God, which I find interesting, right? Because we see that a very similar phrase being used by Luke at the beginning of his gospel in chapter 1, verse 3, that he is, doing this work, writing this book for this Theophilus, right?
Yeah, both Luke, Acts.
Yeah.
So if the listeners don't know, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts is written by the same person, and it's like part 1, part 2. The church part 1, the inception, the church part 2, the ongoing ministry. And it's written to this, what seems to be an individual, Theophilus, right? God lover. It's often argued, though, that could have been a community. It could have been an individual who had commissioned this writing, which I think personally is the one that I'm most convinced of.
Yeah.
We see other writings from the ancient world in Greco-Roman antiquity where with these same sort of inscriptions, I'm writing to you most excellent, which indicates that he could have been a Roman individual of well financial means. And so
it's interesting that she has the same title, right? That she's a God lover, and it's interesting that it's a female.
Yeah,
right?
and that other females are mentioned. So we should mention that the floor has a number of inscriptions. It has this particular inscription with this title giving God and Jesus the same sort of connective tissue. It also has an inscription that names a number of women who are involved in this community. And then on the opposite side, it mentions a Roman centurion who paid by his own financial means for this to be done. And so you have this very interesting mixing of gender and social status, which also kind of breaks the norms of what would have been going on within society.
And if that wasn't enough, of course, the mosaic gets its name because it was found in Megiddo. But it was found in a garrison, a Roman garrison. So this would have been, where Roman soldiers would have been. And this would have been a place of worship there. I mean, that's fascinating. You're 230 and you got Romans worshiping Jesus as God, or Gentiles, right? Like that this was a part of their tradition at that time, or they had that freedom, if you will.
And a period of time where Christianity, in different pockets, was being persecuted across the Roman Empire. And remember that Christianity wasn't decriminalized as a public religion that could be practiced outside of the oversight of the Roman Empire until 313 with Constantine at the Peace of the Church. So until that particular proclamation, it wasn't easy to be a Christian.
But I think you would agree, though, at around 230, though,
Yes, and this is a very bold statement for that early on. I mean, just to say God, Jesus Christ, putting the two together. I mean, you don't really always see statements of that, that concrete in a way this early. Now, you definitely have people like Origen of Alexandria who would be around the same time, right? He is talking about the eternal generation of the Son. So you're definitely getting those conversations, and he's a very big deal and a very big influence. So that language is certainly going to be in the culture. But again, he's a bit of a subordinationist still. This is way before the Council of Nicaea, okay? So before those
100
affirmations.
years
Exactly.
Council of Nicaea, which is significant.
Significant there. Then you also have like people like Tertullian would be around the same time as well. He's formulating, giving us the language of the Trinity, which we will later adopt. But to really see in actual practice among Gentiles, among actual people who are worshiping Jesus Christ, to see this statement, Jesus is God. That's just, it adds and reinforces, I think, this idea of an early Christological development that they're all focused on.
Yeah, and there's a particular feature in the inscription that is worth noting, in that when you look at, say, something like early biblical manuscripts, there's this scribal feature that is common called nomina sacra.
Yeah, what does that mean?
So that's Latin for sacred names. And we're not 100% sure exactly why Christians start to produce these abbreviations, but what they start to do is they start to take either the first two letters and the last letter, or the first letter and the last letter of a word, like Jesus, Jesus, or Kurios, Lord, or Huios, Son.
Or God.
Or God, yeah, Theos. And they would then take, they would abbreviate it, they would squish it, say the first letter, the theta for theos, and the sigma at the end of the theos, theta, sigma, and then they would put a line over top. And we see this commonly all throughout the manuscripts of the New Testament. And even, Andy, when you and I were in Egypt a couple of summers ago and we looked at the Gospel of Thomas, we see the Gnostics adopting these things in their appropriation of early Christian literature. But it's once again, it's trying to copy what the early Christians are doing. And so we find that within the manuscript tradition. We've seen that in a number of manuscripts that we've looked at here at the Museum of the Bible. But to see it then written on a floor, that's interesting.
I see what you're saying, that it's not just in a manuscript, but that we're even seeing it on a floor. And I got to ask, Wes, what are some ideas that people have for why they might do this?
Yeah, so there are some theories in terms of the abbreviation of, maybe this is something analogous to when the Jews had these scribal practices of the sacred name of the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, Yavhe Vavhe, where we see traditions of them, say, leaving it in the Paleo-Hebrew. In fact, even in Greek manuscripts of the Greek translations of the Old Testament, sometime when they get to the divine name, they will stop writing it in Greek and they'll write it in Paleo-Hebrew and then continue on in Greek as sort of this reminder that there's something special going on about this name. Or the whole reason why we have the word Jehovah is because there was this practice that developed probably orally just prior to Jesus, but then when you get to, say, the Middle Ages and the Masoretic scribes, these Jewish traditional scribes, are developing these vowel pointing systems within the manuscripts, what they start to do is they take the consonants of Yahweh, Yavhe, Wawhe, and the vowels of Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for my Lord, and they squish them together. So the consonants of Yahweh, the vowels of Adonai gives you the word Yahweh, which is not a real word. It's not a Hebrew word. But the Jews would have seen that funny word, and it would have been a reminder, don't say this name out loud in order to, say, not commit blasphemy, not, say the Lord's name in vain. Yeah. And say instead Adonai. Read the vowels instead of the consonants. And so later on, when you get, in translation, particularly in the Germanic languages, they would take that Y, which becomes a J later on in German and English, and they would just write it out straight, Jehovah, instead of Yahweh. And that's where we get Jehovah. But this was never something a Jew would have said. This was something a Jew would have seen as like a visual reminder to not say the divine name out loud. And so there were these traditions that developed within ancient Judaism that around reverence towards divine things. And so one of the theories, which is highly debated, mind you, is that when we see something like the nomina sacra, And we see Christians developing these scribal traditions around reverence for particular words. Jesus, Christ, God, Son, even cross and blood are in there sometimes. Is that kind of a carrying over of this Jewish tradition? Maybe. We're not entirely sure. There are some caveats to this. But either way, this is something that Christians start to do specifically that we don't see being done in, say, like Hellenistic classical literature for similar words.
It's interesting that even in the Mosaic, you get it in two ways. One is you have that line that's above it, but then we also see a dot on either side of God, Jesus, and Christ, which is it would seem we're not exactly sure why they're doing it.
Yeah,
but
it's conjectural, but they're sectioning this out as like a stylistic or artistic way of saying this is special.
Hey guys, my name is Troy, Creative Director for Apologetics Canada and your host and MC for the upcoming Apologetics Canada conference titled Theology of Technology. I just wanted to give you guys a quick update.
The worship center is full.
But don't panic, you can still join us for the on-site live stream right here in Westcourt, but you've got to sign up today. Spots are going to fill up. And when you sign up, you still get access to the exhibitor tables, the merch table, as well as all of the breakout session speakers. So do yourself a favor and sign up today, please, okay? Spots are limited and they are going to fill up. So head to apologeticscanadaconference.com right now. We want to see you in here. It's going to be a great time.
On top of that, our annual Ontario Apologetics Canada Leadership Summit up at Camp Madiba is happening May 30th to June 1st. And registration is now open. Our Leadership Summit seeks to bring together aspiring Christian thought leaders from across the country for an incredible weekend of networking and equipping. This is an opportunity for young professionals and student leaders aged 19 to 30 to meet one another and to grow together as Christian leaders. Join myself and a handpicked group of mentors and teachers for an incredible weekend of fellowship, teaching, and equipping. But space is limited. We can only accept a certain number of applicants, so make sure you're heading over to the AC website homepage to find out how to apply. All information on either the BC Conference or the Leadership Summit can be found at apologeticscanada.com.
Speaking of special, what are your thoughts with regards to this high Christology that we're seeing this early on, right? Because people often say, it's not until way later that the church kind of comes to this idea, or people start, inventing this idea that Jesus is God sort of idea.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, the ways in which Christology develops and the way in which some people have imagined that sort of new information is being added. We were talking earlier about this idea of there were many messianic pretenders. Their movements all got squashed with the death of their Messiah. That's when it ended. Not with this one. Clearly something developed. And the idea that somehow a mythology can start around a human being, and we all know that there are examples of this. There can be attestations of legend or something like that that can get attached to people. But when you were talking about the claims of Jesus being God, that is a much greater claim than some of the things I think we often associate with legend. Name another place where that's happened. You don't see it. You take like the legend of Arthur, for instance. I mean, that developed over 500 years and all he got was a magical sword, right? This isn't the same thing. Clearly you see something developing that is already there, present in the Synoptic Gospels. It gets developed into something theological in the Gospel of John. And as we're seeing from things like this, it's built into the community of believers. They understand Jesus and the Father are one.
Well, I think there's something also to be said about the fact that the statement that we have here is to commemorate who did it and that it was as a memorial, right? And particularly, she is credited for the table. So the Roman centurion is the one who commissioned and paid for the mosaic. She's the one who commissioned this table, and so, as you were saying, Wes, most likely this table was a communion, table. That this would have been a remembrance of who Christ was, what he accomplished, right? His life, death, and resurrection. That he is, that it was through his body being broken and his blood being shed that we are that we are free. So it's kind of, it brings back this idea of, well, what's different than from Jesus and all these other would-be messiahs?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our friend Glenn Scrivener, friend of the ministry, who spoke at our Ontario conference, one of the things he says that I really like is that one of the best evidences for Jesus' resurrection is that we're still talking about it.
Absolutely.
Right? In that, you have other individuals. When we were talking earlier, I mentioned Simon Bar-Giora. Like, how many people who are listening right now know who Simon Bar-Giora is? He was a messianic figure in the first century. And when he died, so did his movement. And there are multiple other examples. Simon Bar Kokhba, they aren't just all mentioned named Simon, but there are individuals within the ancient world who claim to be messianic figures who started things like revolutions, which is what they were expecting the Messiah to be, and they died, and so did their movement, so did their followers, and yet, what do we see in the New Testament?
It's a good point about, when you look to the early church and you look at what some of those writers were saying, what were the apologists of the early church saying about, why this is true? A lot of them were pointing to the fact that the church exists, right? That was the language they were using. They were pointing directly at the community of believers and saying, that's all the proof we need.
And I think we see this type of expectation within the disciples themselves. They're in the upper room. Judas has committed suicide. There's 11 of them. And even when Mary comes back and says, the Lord is risen, the tomb is empty, what does Thomas say? I'm not going to believe until I see it myself, until I put my fingers into his wounds. He's still like, no, I'm not going to get my hopes up. I can't do that. And so the fact that 11 scared disciples go from hiding, scared in an upper room, to then going out into the world and being willing to face the persecution of the Roman Empire, leading to Roman centurions commissioning floors that include descriptions as Jesus as God within only a couple hundred years. I mean, that's some pretty strong evidence. And then breaking these cultural expectations, Roman centurions and women. And this was a point of mockery. What is some of the earliest discussions of Christianity describe them as? The religions of slave women and children. Because these were groups that, we don't care about.
Now we see that as a badge of honor.
Right.
Absolutely.
Back then it was seen like this, what a joke.
And ironically, some of the accusations against Christianity today are, well, they don't treat women right. Right? When if you look at history, the accusations were they treat women right to begin with, or you have letters. I think it was Trajan to Pliny, who he says, they're not just taking care of their own, they're taking care of our poor. Like, this is embarrassing.
Embarrassing on their.
So we have multiple lines of attestation of how early Christianity is really impacting the world. Actually, I think the letter of Trajan to Pliny is the one where he says that they meet early in the morning and they sing to Christ as to a god.
Right.
We have these literary explanations, or from the early church fathers, from Irenaeus defending against the heretics and the Ebionites and the Gnostics. But then when we do find things like this, and it's these multiple lines of attestation that point to, okay, these people are saying it, these people are making fun of Christianity for this, but then look at what we can actually point to that's being not just written in texts, but inscribed in mosaics.
And I think what you said at the very beginning is really important to highlight. That
What I say is always important to highlight. Andy. Thank you very much.
But this is. Thanks, Wes.
Yeah, you're welcome. Keep going.
Yeah, it's always important. But honestly, with regards to this being the earliest attestation of Jesus as God outside of the Bible, and I think it's just important that we acknowledge that the Bible talks about, not only does Jesus talk about himself being God, which we've talked about on this podcast before, but that the gospel writers and the disciples are talking about Jesus as being God. And just even to use Thomas, as you've already brought up, Thomas doesn't believe at first, right? He goes, I want to see the evidence for myself. But then what does he say when he sees the evidence?
Yeah, hakorios mu kai hatheos mu, my Lord and my God, which is only in context being described to Jesus. The subject and the object is his Lord and his God is Jesus. So, and that's what we see going right into, the proclamation of the early church.
Because I want to just highlight this real quick. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I just think it's interesting. I have seen some people push back on this mosaic and say, oh, but it doesn't mean, Jesus is God big G. It means Jesus is God little g.
Mm-hmm.
And
to which I say there are only capitals in Greek at this point, so everything's a big letter.
But to me, I just, how would you guys respond to that? I definitely know how I would respond to, but I think it's a little silly, actually.
It is a little silly. I think the very fact that, there's something to be said, I think, about form and content here. I mean, the fact that this is being put on a mosaic that is on the floor of a house of prayer, this is the thing they are centering themselves around in worship. So the idea that somehow they are putting Jesus alongside God, but, not the big G God, not that God. We want to, get somehow into he's a little bit more subordinate than that. It seems unlikely given the nature of the way that it's presented.
Well, I think even we see these discussions of the persecution of early Christians where they're called atheists. Some of the earliest descriptions of Christians are
Polycarp's martyrdom, right? It's away with the atheists.
Yeah. They're atheists and they're antisocial because they deny that the gods exist. And there was this idea within the ancient world where your religion and your identity and your ethnicity could be tied very intricately. And so the Jews were allowed to get away with being monotheists because they're this weird ethnic group that lives over there in the armpit of the Roman Empire anyways. But the thing that was unique about Christianity is that they were Roman centurions, right? People who are expected to then have a particular religious Gentile pagan association. And what are they doing? They're converting to Christianity and then saying, actually, this pantheon, this panoply of other gods that everyone says exists, they don't actually exist. And this was a kind of a pain point within early Christianity for persecution, because Tertullian says in his writing, this early church writer, that when the Nile is too high or the Tiber, so the rivers in Egypt or in Rome, the Nile is too high or the Tiber is too low, the cry will ring out, the Christians, the lions. And why does he say that? It's because, you have these cities, say Athens, where the city god is Athena. And if there's a famine, if there's a flood, if there's some sort of issue within the city and they go, okay, why does this happen? Well, there are these people running around. They're running around saying Athena doesn't even actually exist. Right. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to make Athena feel better about this, and we're gonna kill the Christians.
Well, just to tease us out a little bit more. So they're saying basically, well, this is happening because these people aren't respecting the gods. Yeah. Right? They're not worshiping as they ought to. This is happening to us, so we're going to then persecute them so that the gods don't.
And they're these strange bunch of hodgepodge. They're not one ethnicity. They're not like the Jews, who are this kind of Semitic Canaanite group over there. They're all sorts of people. That's right, yeah. They're no one demographic.
You get that narrative. There's a famous story, right, of Pompey when he sacks Jerusalem in 63 and comes into the temple and realizes there's nothing here. And like you said, that's fine for the Jews. They keep to themselves. But the moment Christianity gets a hold of this idea and invites everybody in, you can only imagine the sort of political upheaval that is going to be created. And on that point, if that's the way that Christians are seeing things, if they're being aligned with that sort of atheism, then clearly a statement that takes the name of Jesus and puts it in concert with God, it means they're not making a distinction. They're bringing those things together. This absence of deities also implies that our worship belongs to Jesus Christ and Him alone.
Yeah, we don't find caveats to this. It's similar to the accusation when you see people trying to downplay when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, or I and the Father, we are one. And people say, well, he's not really saying what you think he's saying. But he doesn't then say to the Jews when they pick up stones to stone him for the statement, he doesn't say, well, no, I'm not actually saying I'm truly one with the Father, or I'm not claiming to exist hundreds of years before this time and actually be. No, he's not making those caveats.
Well, and let's be clear, Mark makes it clear that Caiaphas is condemning Jesus to crucifixion, to death. Yeah. Because of his blasphemy.
Yeah, you've heard the blasphemy, and then tears his robe. And the accusation of being a son of God, there is no blasphemy. There's no Jewish law against claiming to be a son of God. And this is something, my Muslim friends bring up all the time. Oh, there's sons by the tons in the Old Testament.
Sons by the tons. Yeah.
Right? And they're not wrong, right? David was a son of God, Elisha was a son of God. But what is Jesus claiming? He's not claiming to be a son of God. He's claiming to be the Son of God in a way that the Jews understand. You're making yourself equal with the Father.
This brings us back to the Kenotic hymn, doesn't it? Right? I mean, and this is precisely, I think sometimes skeptics want Jesus to have, affirmed his God nature in a way that fits what they want. Well, I'm not satisfied until he says it exactly like this.
That's such
but
a good
of course,
point.
the Kenotic hymn tells us that equality with God was something that Jesus didn't think could be grasped. Right? That's the language that's used.
Yeah, I like the way the new NIV puts it.
Yes.
Used to his own advantage.
Doesn't want to rob it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Does not want to steal away the idea of just affirming himself. Who do you say that I am? He puts it in our mouth, right? And says, who are you saying that I am? Watch these deeds. See how I functionally am, right?
Yeah. Jesus claims to be God in a Jewish accent.
That's a great way to put
right?
it.
In a way that they would have understood. So we want him, like my Muslim friends, they want me to show them where does Jesus ever say, I am God, worship me? Well, he did not say that, and he would not have said that because it doesn't make any sense. But then what does he do? He calms the storms, which Job says God does. He makes the blind see, which Isaiah says God does.
Or one
he
of my
raises
favorite.
the dead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. All
Sure,
these things
yeah.
which we see. And so
Fulfills the
I
purpose.
was going to say one of my favorites is in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel says that God says that he is the good shepherd, and then Jesus comes along and says, hey, I'm the good shepherd.
Yeah.
And the Jews that were reading and understood their Old Testament, I think that's why some people don't realize the high Christology. Is like, you need to read your Old Testament, because when you read it and you see it from a Jewish perspective, then you're like, oh, okay, I can see why Caiaphas tore his robe and was like, this guy is blasphemy.
Well, one of my favorites is in all four Gospels, although it's articulated in a different way in John, when Jesus is accused of eating on the Sabbath. And he says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. In John, he says, my Father's working and I'm working to this day, which is a little bit of a different kind of articulation of it, but expressing the same thing. What does it mean to be Lord of the Sabbath? Well, it's essentially claiming that when the Jews rest on the Sabbath, that God is the only one who really has the ability and the authority to continue working, to keep creation, going in order. So when Jesus says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, he's essentially claiming in his Jewish accent, in that way, to be making the sun rise in the morning. And the Jews know exactly what he's saying.
Let's just highlight that for a moment, because I think it's important, because you're like, oh, but are we understanding him correctly? Well, if you want to make sure if you're understanding him correctly, how did the Jews understand him?
Yeah.
Well, they wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
On multiple occasions, where they either are trying to push him off a cliff or whatever, or they're picking up stones to stone him, or they're wondering if God's going to lightning bolt this guy. Why? Because this is blasphemy.
And when we see these things, it's one thing to say I'm God.
Yeah.
Like, we can go to any, hospital where someone is suffering from like a mental breakdown, and maybe they will claim that they are God. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. But it's another thing to prove it. It's another thing to do the things that would be expected for the creator of the universe. And this is exactly what we see. There's a great resource by two individuals, Ed Komazowski and Rob Bowman. Their first publication, I think, was called Putting Jesus in His Place, or Getting Jesus Right, something like that. And their recent publication, which is an update to it, is called Christ and His Critics. And in it, they have this great acronym that I use, HANDS, that Jesus is given the honors, attributes, names, deeds, and seat of God throughout the New Testament. So all you have to do when someone says, where's Jesus described as God in the Bible, where you can say he's given the honors that only Yahweh, God alone has. He's given the attributes, the names, the deeds, and then right at the end in Revelation, the same throne that God the Father has is the throne that the Lamb sits on.
And like you said, he's never backpedaling. He's never protecting himself from the accusations that might come from behaving in that way. I think that's one of the things that, again, you see in the Synoptic Gospels, for instance, when people say, well, the Synoptics have a low Christology. And it's like...
By Synoptics, what do you mean?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? The seen together, those three, right, as opposed to John, which is seen as oftentimes, right, the more theological gospel, the one that has the I am sayings, and people use that. But the truth is there, even in the Synoptics, Jesus is accepting worship. right? He's not denying that. And you go to the book of Revelation, you see there's a moment in the book of Revelation where they fall down before the angel and worship, and the angel goes, no, don't worship me. That is reserved only for God himself, right? I don't see Jesus making those same claims, right? I think in many ways he's saying, yeah, it seems you get it, right?
Yeah, ironically, where people accuse Mark of having the lowest Christology, we have, I would argue, one of the highest statements of Christological reverence when Jesus, you mentioned, Andy, when he's before Caiaphas, and they say, are you the Son of the Blessed One? And he says, you shall see the Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven, referring to Daniel chapter 7 about himself. He says, yes. And then he says, you shall see the Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven, referring to Daniel 7 about himself. He is that Son of Man. They understand what he's talking about. I would argue that's the highest statement of divine Christology. And then the most probably human statement in all of the Gospels is spoken on by the words of Jesus on the cross in John, I thirst.
Exactly.
And so if we want to play this like tit for tat game, where's the most divine, where's the most human? I mean, if you really want to pick a few, you can find them all throughout, because guess what? Jesus is fully man and fully God. So this is not a game that we need to pin those against each other or pit those against each other.
And it's okay to see that that is a development of sorts. It's not that they're adding new things to it. It's that what's present there in the person of Jesus Christ in his ministry to begin with is slowly by the culture becoming more and more clear, right? I mean, it's going to take some time. It took the disciples time. They didn't understand things right away. We have to get clear on what this stuff means. And eventually, I mean, that's why we're going to borrow Greek language to express, ousia, hypostasis, all of this stuff that comes into Nicaea. That's not some unwitting syncretism, bringing in stuff that doesn't belong. It's actually this kind of helps articulate who the person of Jesus really is.
I see what you're saying. You're saying, so Jesus is teaching who he is, but it takes time to unpack that.
Absolutely.
Right? The disciples are unpacking it, and then and the early church is unpacking it. One of the things I think is really interesting, maybe is a great place for us to begin to end here, is that Jesus makes all these claims, and this is something that Jesus even talks about. Anybody can claim these sorts of things, right? He makes a claim like this in Mark 2, where he says to somebody, his sins are forgiven. It's like, well, anybody could say that, but do you have the authority? Are you actually who you're claiming to be? And that's where the resurrection is so interesting, because Jesus is saying, first of all these miracles that he's doing is actually not just to do miracles. They're to demonstrate that he is who he's been claiming to be. And then we see the greatest miracle of all, that he's murdered. He demonstrates, first of all, his love to even those that are just, killing him. And then he takes his life back up. He's like, I'm actually who I was claiming to be all along and could do what I claimed. And I think it's so fascinating that this mosaic is the centerpiece of this, is the memorial of that, is the remembrance that Jesus didn't say it, that he is who he claimed to be. He is the bread, and he is the wine. He is the life eternal, that's found in him. And I believe that for the disciples, that changed everything. I love how Gary Habermas put it. He said, when the disciples saw Jesus return from the dead, they didn't just see a man come back from the dead. They saw walking, talking eternal life. They saw a man who would never die again. He had defeated death. Very different from Lazarus, right? Lazarus would die again, but Jesus had defeated death.
Jesus was resurrected. Lazarus was revivified.
Yeah.
He was in the same body, right?
Jesus
was the first fruits. He had a new, resurrected, glorified, eternal body. Someone asked me about this. When Joe Rogan asked me, could Jesus have survived? I think what I didn't say to him, I said in a different kind of conversation I had with someone else, was that, if the disciples had seen Jesus surviving the crucifixion in a very carnal, human way, and they'd seen kind of the devastation that was done to his body, they would not have then concluded, this is the glorified Son of God in an eternal body.
Worthy of worship.
This is the resurrected body I want. No, that's not what they would have concluded. So there was something drastically different. And to your point earlier, Ben, I think, there's something to say about, we might feel uncomfortable with that developmental language, but we also have to remember that we live 2,000 years later, and we stand on the shoulders of giants who in this early church period were hammering these things out. We believe in one God. Okay, Jesus is God, the Spirit is God, the Father is God. How do we understand that? And that's what really leads up to Nicaea and the doctrinal statement And they're wrestling through these things. And we have the benefit to have the terminology, to have the language, and we can assume that. But really, we assume that because so many before us have articulated that and wrestled through that and come up with this language that we now use.
Yeah. Well, this is a great place to end. I just want you to know this mosaic was unearthed. It was discovered in 2005. They actually found it when they were in Megiddo and were going to expand a prison there. And as they were doing that, they uncovered this. And then they began to excavate it. It took a very long time to do so. It is now on exhibit here at the Museum of the Bible. It's been here since September, and it's going to be here, what did they say, July, guys?
Yeah, July 2025.
Yeah, July 6th, I think it was, something like that, 2025. I would highly encourage you, come out to the museum here and take a look, because once this exhibit is done, they're going to be taking it back to Israel, and then they're going to be setting up a place to view it actually there in Megiddo at that prison site. So that, who knows how long that's going to take. So if you want to see it, you better come here to take a look. I also want to just encourage you that Wes and I are going to be off. We are starting the filming for the next episode of Can I Trust the Bible? You're not going to want to miss that. And to make sure that you are with us on every step of that journey, make sure to follow us on our socials, subscribe to YouTube. But also, I'd encourage you to get onto our email database, because if you're on that, you're going to get the early access to it. And as well, Wes and I not only have some filmmakers are going to be with us, but we're also going to be filming and posting onto our socials while we're on the journey. So you're going to get a lot of cool content that you're not going to find elsewhere.
That's great.
Well, thank you for joining us on the AC Podcast. It's been a ministry of Apologetics Canada. You know the drill. Love God, love people. We'll see you next time.